On Tuesday morning, March 9, 1993, Ruth Bellamy clipped an $800 cashier's check to a gate post outside Morrow, Kansas, with 40 gaunt adult bison beyond it. Dale Albrecht looked through the wire and said, "You'll spend more burying them than buying them." The price was excellent. At least that's what everyone thought. The habit that would create that waiting list had begun 4 years earlier, when Ruth Bellamy drew a narrow column down the back page of a cheap green spiral notebook and wrote down every plant the Bellamy cattle stepped around. In 1989, it was merely a private count of rejected grass, the sort of thing nobody asked for and nobody thought to keep. 4 years later, those same numbers would decide whether 40 underfed bison lived on forage already standing or consumed the last cash the Bellamys had. Ruth was 28 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, wiry through the waist and broad through the shoulders from handling gaits that never swung as freely as they should. Her chestnut-brown hair was center-parted and braided to the middle of her back, and thin oval steel glasses sat above freckles scattered across her narrow nose. She walked with measured, heel-first steps, wore a faded olive canvas chore coat over a cream work shirt, and carried the green notebook everywhere. Let me tell you about the Bellamy acreage, because you need to understand what the cattle left before you can understand what Ruth bought. Bellamy Range lay outside Morrow in Custer County, Kansas, where 640 acres looked generous from the county road and considerably smaller from the kitchen table. The family owned 480 acres and leased another 160. Their cattle used the lower draws, the improved grass nearest the wells, and the cleaner patches where an animal could fill its mouth without sorting stems. What remained stood shoulder-high in places, weathered silver and brown through winter, with seed heads rattling whenever the north wind came down flat across the county. The Bellamys carried $38,700 in operating debt. They had $4,912 in cash. Those figures were not tragic. They were facts, and facts were easier to work with than worry. The debt covered cattle expenses, machinery repairs, taxes, and an operating note that renewed each spring. The cash had to carry the household and the range until cattle checks arrived. There was room for one careful decision. There was no room for two careless ones. Ruth had written the acreage in her notebook, then divided it into pasture types. She marked the grazed portions in blue pencil and the rejected portions in green. She clipped small paper envelopes to the pages, each containing dried stems from a different slope, swale, or fence corner. Where cattle had left coarse switchgrass untouched, she measured height. Where big bluestem remained above the snow line, she counted stems inside a square frame made from baling wire. Where western wheatgrass held its leaves near the ground, she cut, dried, and weighed it. Nobody had told her to do that. On the morning Warren Pike offered his herd, Ruth followed him into an empty hay barn 12 miles west of Morrow. Warren was 61, tall and lean, with weather-reddened skin, iron-gray hair cropped close around a receding hairline, and a full short beard the same color. Gold wire-rim glasses rested beneath heavy silver brows. He wore a brown duck-cloth jacket, faded jeans, and dusty tan work boots, and he moved in long, careful strides with his shoulders pitched slightly forward. The barn held 6 broken strings of hay, a bent pitchfork, and enough loose chaff to show where the winter supply had been. Warren removed a folded cream feed invoice from his breast pocket and opened it against the hood of his pickup. The fold had nearly worn through the paper. "I can bring hay from Hayes," he said. "That is not the problem." He tapped the freight line with one long finger. The problem was what happened after the hay reached his gate. The 40 bison were already thin, which meant he could not simply provide one heavy feeding and walk away. He needed grass hay delivered through the remainder of winter, mineral, handling labor, and another truck when the ground firmed enough to move them. The feed and hauling would cost $5,310. That figure did not include a single fence repair or veterinary visit. Warren had 34 adult cows, 5 yearling females, and 1 adult bull. They were underfed, but they were standing. Their eyes followed movement. Their manure was loose in some places and dry in others. Several cows carried their ribs plainly beneath winter hair, while the bull held more frame than flesh along his spine. Warren could spend $5,310 to stop them declining on his ground, or he could sell all 40 adults to Ruth for $800 and stop the loss immediately. $20 a head, he said. Ruth looked through the barn opening toward the pasture. "That is what the check says. You understand why?" "Yes." Warren folded the invoice and returned it to his pocket. He did not try to persuade her. He had already completed the arithmetic, and the empty barn stood behind him like a second opinion. The price was nearly free because the animals were worth less to Warren than the expense of keeping them through the next feed delivery. That did not make them worthless. It meant the cost had moved somewhere else, and Ruth needed to know exactly where. She opened the green notebook across the pickup hood. Her pale blue eyes moved down 3 columns, feed on one side, standing forage on another, recovery costs in the middle. A faint crescent-shaped birthmark showed beneath her right ear where the braid pulled her hair clear. "When do you need an answer?" she asked. "Before the carrier takes the hay order tomorrow." Ruth closed the notebook. "I will call tonight." She drove home without stopping at the co-op. The cashier's check had not yet been purchased, and the 40 bison still belonged to Warren Pike. The decision could have remained hers alone if she had been willing to treat family ground and family cash as though they belonged to whoever had the newest idea. She was not. By late afternoon, the wind had turned colder. Ruth crossed the yard in her scuffed brown work boots, climbed the kitchen step, and wiped each sole twice on the iron scraper beside the door. She did not call for her mother from the mudroom. She removed her chore coat, hung it from the same peg it always occupied, and kept the notebook beneath her arm. Helen Bellamy was in the kitchen weighing a paper sack of dried forage from the West Quarter. Her brass hanging scale was hooked over the pantry door, and the sack swung gently beneath it. Ruth waited until the pointer settled. Helen wrote the weight on a scrap of envelope, lowered the sack, and looked at the green notebook. Ruth carried it across the kitchen and placed it unopened beside the brass forage scale on the Bellamy kitchen table. The notebook rested there between them, its wire bent at the top and its green paper cover darkened along the edges by 4 years of sweat, dust, and kitchen grease. Let me tell you about Helen Bellamy, because you need to understand how she measured risk before you can understand why her permission mattered. Helen was 57 in 1993, 5 feet 5 inches tall, with a sturdy build and an upright posture that made her seem taller when she stood at the kitchen table. Her ash-brown hair, threaded with silver, was gathered into a smooth, low bun. Brown cat-eye reading glasses hung from a cord over a burgundy wool cardigan, and a compact cluster of freckles marked her left temple. She had gray eyes, a broad jaw, and a pale oval birthmark across the back of her right hand. That hand rested on the notebook without opening it. Helen had taught Ruth one sentence before Ruth was old enough to hold a pasture map flat in the wind. Count what the ground gives before you buy what the catalog sells. The sentence applied to hay, seed, fence posts, machinery, and nearly anything else a salesperson could put in a glossy booklet. Helen did not mean that catalogs lied. She meant that a person who bought first and counted later had surrendered the only useful advantage a farm offered, which was the chance to know its ground better than anyone selling something to it. When Ruth was younger, Helen had sent her into the north pasture with a flour sack and a kitchen shears, not to learn the names of grasses, but to learn that 1 acre did not give the same thing in May that it gave in November. Helen weighed each sample on the brass forage scale. Ruth wrote the figures down. They repeated the work after rain, after frost, and after grazing. The scale was older than Ruth. Its brass face had a shallow dent below the number 5, and the hook had been repaired with a neatly peened rivet. Helen trusted it because she checked it against known weights every spring. She opened Ruth's notebook. The first pages contained rainfall records copied from the county office, month by month, beginning in 1987. Blue pencil lines showed runoff channels. Red marks showed places where cattle had grazed below Ruth's preferred residual height. Several clipped pasture maps unfolded from the spiral binding, their corners softened by use. The books behind those pages had cost almost nothing. Ruth had bought discarded range management manuals from a vocational school sale for 50 cents apiece. She had requested veterinary texts through interlibrary loan and copied chapters by hand because the library would not let the books leave the building. A retired instructor's handbook on ruminant digestion came from a farm auction in a box with seed catalogs, 3 cracked binders, and a broken stapler. Ruth paid $0.25 for the box. She had spent 2 years taking forage samples from the Bellamy ground. Nobody else had the results because nobody else had thought the rejected stems were worth testing. Helen turned to a page headed with Warren Pike's name. Ruth had not assumed bison could live on brown grass merely because bison had lived on plains before feed stores existed. That kind of reasoning could kill an animal while sounding wonderfully natural. Bison could use fibrous, coarse dormant grasses cattle often left behind, but their rumen still depended on microbial fermentation, adequate protein, water, minerals, and time to adjust. If crude protein fell too low, rumen microbes could not break fiber down fast enough. Intake dropped. Condition followed. A mineral imbalance could reduce appetite or interfere with muscle and nerve function. Parasites could steal nutrients from an animal that appeared to be eating. Abrupt feeding carried another danger. A thin ruminant given unrestricted grain could consume starch faster than its rumen population could manage it. Acidity could rise. Normal fiber-digesting microbes could collapse. The animal could become sicker after receiving what looked like generous feed. Ruth's plan depended on coarse forage, but it did not pretend coarse forage was complete feed. Helen read the pasture tests first. She placed one finger beneath each line and moved it slowly. The north ground held dormant switchgrass, big bluestem, and western wheatgrass in quantities the cattle had not used. Ruth had calculated usable dry matter after allowing for trampling, weather loss, inaccessible patches, and a residual layer that would remain after grazing. She had not counted every standing pound as edible. The second column contained expected intake. Ruth estimated each animal by weight and condition, then used conservative percentages rather than healthy herd averages. The third column contained costs: purchase $800, hauling $312, veterinary work $186.40, hay $1,104, mineral $128.60, fencing $438.75, chute parts $74.20. Helen added the figures on paper even though Ruth had already written the total, $3,043.95. That left $1,868.05 from the Bellamy's cash, provided nothing exceeded the plan and the household spent nothing unexpected. Helen turned the page. Ruth had written contingencies. If the fecal tests showed a parasite burden beyond the veterinary allowance, she would postpone breeding and sell equipment before borrowing for grain. If the standing forage tested below the minimum needed for rumen function, she would stop. If the animals could not be handled safely in the borrowed chute, she would pay to move them again rather than attempt treatment loose. Helen read every line. The kitchen clock clicked from 7:22 to 8:11. Ruth sat opposite her with both feet flat on the linoleum and her hands around a cup of coffee she did not drink. Helen removed her glasses once, cleaned them on the hem of her white checked blouse, and returned to the pasture maps. At 8:12, she closed the notebook. "I need to think about it." Ruth nodded. Helen did not approve the purchase that night. She did not dismiss it either. She carried the notebook to the small desk off the kitchen and set it beside the operating ledger. Ruth called Warren and asked for 3 days. "You have 2, he said. "I need 3. There was a pause. 3. The following morning, Helen walked the north ground with the brass scale wrapped in a flour sack and hanging from one hand. Her dark brown lace-up shoes took short, deliberate steps across the frozen ridges. Ruth remained near the barn repairing a water valve and did not follow her. Helen cut samples from 5 locations, weighed them damp, dried portions over the kitchen register, and compared them with Ruth's figures. On the second day, she telephoned the veterinarian and asked 3 questions about quarantine, parasite testing, and emergency handling costs. She asked no question about whether bison were fashionable or profitable. Those were not the risks Ruth's plan rested upon. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time someone told you they needed time to think, and you mistook that for doubt? Helen was not delaying because she failed to understand Ruth's numbers. She was checking whether the numbers survived contact with someone besides the person who wanted them to be true. On the 3rd morning, Ruth entered the kitchen before sunrise. Helen wore charcoal twilled trousers and the same burgundy cardigan. The green notebook lay beside the brass scale. Helen held it out. Use the north ground, no grain debt. That condition made the purchase possible, but it also removed the easiest response to every difficulty that might follow. Ruth could buy hay within the amount already written. She could supply tested mineral. She could pay for veterinary work. She could not cover a weak grazing plan with borrowed grain and call the animals profitable. Ruth accepted the notebook. All right. She drove first to the livestock carrier's yard. The carrier charged $312 to collect the 40 bison from Warren's place and deliver them to Bellamy Range, provided Ruth supplied a safe unloading lane and signed for waiting time after the first half hour. Ruth paid a deposit and wrote the remaining amount beside the scheduled date. Next came the chute. The Bellamy's cattle chute was too lightly built and too open along the sides for adult bison. Ruth borrowed a heavy-duty, solid-sided chute from a rancher who no longer used it. Its frame was rated above 2,000 pounds, but two hinge pins had worn oval against their holes, the lower latch dragged, and one side panel flexed where a timber spacer had rotted away. Ruth agreed to replace the worn hinge pins and return the chute cleaner than she received it. She wrote $74.20 beneath the chute page, then drove to the Morrow Co-op. Let me tell you about Dale Albrecht, because you need to understand why his laugh carried weight before you can understand what his apology cost. Dale was 49, stocky, 5 feet 10 inches tall, and built like a man who had spent 19 years lifting sacks from the floor instead of waiting for someone younger to do it. His sandy gray hair was neatly side-parted. A trimmed mustache crossed his upper lip, and square black-framed glasses sat above a blunt nose and a heavy rectangular jaw. A red carpenter's pencil remained in the pocket of his blue chambray shirt, usually beneath a tan canvas vest. Dale knew the feeding history of nearly every operation within 20 miles. He had extended drought accounts when a delayed cattle check meant the difference between feeding through April and selling in March. He could calculate hay use while leaning on the counter, and he remembered which customers added a margin for waste and which ones always came back surprised. He was decent. He was also difficult to impress. Ruth placed her parts list on the counter: hinge pins, washers, latch hardware, insulated fence handles, and 2 rolls of visible electric braid. Dale read it once. "What are you holding? Bison. How many? 40 adults. Whose? Warren Pike's." Dale looked over the top of his glasses. What did he ask? $800. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing. It was a low, surprised laugh, 2 short breaths followed by one longer one, the sound of 19 years of feed bills meeting an unfamiliar system and mistaking unfamiliar for impossible. He did not point at her. He did not call anyone else from the storeroom. He set both hands on the counter and shook his head once. "You are buying 40 mouths because they are cheap. I am buying 40 adults because I have forage. You have what cattle left? Yes. They will eat purchased feed when that runs out." Ruth opened the notebook to the North Ground page. Usable dry matter after 50% loss is 178,400 pounds. Expected average intake begins at 14 pounds per head and rises with condition. The first 42 days are covered by measured hay and standing forage. After that, the moves follow tested paddock supply. Dale reached for the red carpenter's pencil. "You are counting brown stems. I am counting dry matter." He marked the hinge pins on her list. "The bull alone can weigh close to 2,000 pounds. The chute is rated above that. And when those cows push through your wire, solid perimeter fence. Electric interior control after training." Dale totaled the counter items and turned the sales slip toward her. Ruth looked at the figure. "I'll need a receipt." That was all. Dale tore the receipt free and placed it on the counter. His laugh had not changed the pasture tests, and Ruth saw no reason to spend words defending figures that would soon be weighed again in hay, manure, and body condition. She left carrying a narrow cardboard box of hardware under one arm. Up to this point, Ruth had been able to revise numbers, delay calls, or close the notebook and return Warren's offer unanswered. That was about to flip. Warren waited beside his kitchen table with a bill of sale already typed. The paper listed 34 adult cows, 5 yearling females, and 1 adult bull. 40 animals at $20 each. $800 total. The folded feed invoice remained in his breast pocket. Ruth read the bill from top to bottom. Warren watched through his gold wire-rimmed glasses without speaking. "You want individual numbers added after unloading?" he asked. "I'll record them during processing. They are not all going to walk into a chute for you." "They don't have to do it together." Warren signed first. His handwriting leaned sharply to the right. Ruth signed beneath him, then placed the cashier's check on the table. Warren touched the check with one fingertip but did not immediately pick it up. "If this works," he said, "it will be because your grass was cheaper than my hay. If it works, I'll know how much grass they used." He gave one small nod and folded the bill of sale in half. The carrier arrived the next morning with solid-sided livestock compartments, heavy gates, and a driver who had moved bison before. Loading took longer than expected because the adults did not flow evenly through Warren's lane. Ruth stood outside the pressure zone and watched the driver use the gates to reduce space without forcing the animals into a blind corner. The bull entered last. Warren closed the loading gate and kept one hand on it after the latch dropped. The feed invoice showed above his jacket pocket. 40 out, he said. Ruth looked at the carrier. 40 out? At Bellamy Range, Helen stood beside the north lane with the brass forage scale hanging from one hand, though nothing yet needed weighing. Ruth had lined the approach with old plywood and wagon panels so the animals would see one continuous wall instead of gaps opening toward the yard. The carrier turned wide, crossed the cattle guard slowly, and straightened with the unloading lane. The tires pressed dark tracks into the thawing ground. There was no practical way to return the herd without another hauling bill. There was no unused cash large enough to replace a failed winter. The experiment had ceased to be a plan. The carrier backed through the Bellamy gate, and Ruth wrote 40 in beneath the date. Those words filled less than an inch of paper, but the borrowed chute now determined whether Ruth could safely learn what condition the 40 adults were actually in. Let me tell you about that borrowed chute, because you need to understand restraint before you can understand the treatment. An adult bison could injure itself against a poorly designed opening before a person standing outside understood what had gone wrong. A wide visual gap invited turning. A rattling panel encouraged backing. A weak latch could hold until the exact moment an animal committed its weight against it. Ruth needed the chute to limit movement without creating new places for legs, horns, or shoulders to catch. She unloaded the animals directly into the north holding pasture and left them water, space, and quiet while she finished the handling lane. The replacement parts cost $74.20. Ruth spread them on a feed sack inside the equipment shed. 2 hardened hinge pins, heavy washers, a latch plate, bolts, insulated fasteners, and timber blocking cut from a dry oak beam. She drove the old pins out with a hammer and a punch inherited from her father's workbench, cleaned rust from the hinge sleeves, and checked the new pins for free movement before fitting the retaining clips. The oak blocking removed flex from the lower panel. Ruth replaced the dragging latch plate, then leaned her full weight against the gate and worked it 12 times. The first 6 closures scraped. She loosened the bolts, shifted the plate by less than 1/8 of an inch, and tightened it again. The next 6 landed cleanly. She lined the approach with solid panels tall enough to block the yard from view. Bison entering the lane could see the animal ahead and the opening forward, but not a moving person through every rail. Ruth removed a loose chain that struck the panel when the wind moved it. She wrapped one bright steel corner with a strip of old conveyor belting to eliminate glare. Only after the lane stayed quiet in the wind did she call the veterinarian. The veterinarian arrived with sample containers, a thermometer, treatment equipment, and a scale tape. Ruth processed the adults singly. She did not estimate medication from the way winter hair made an animal look. Each adult received an identification record. Ruth noted sex, distinguishing marks, estimated weight, temperature where safely obtainable, manure consistency, and body condition score. The score mattered because hair could hide the sharpness beneath. Hands and eyes had to account for fat cover over the ribs, spine, hooks, and pins, while restraint time remained short enough to avoid creating stress for the sake of a perfect note. Helen stood outside the working lane with the green notebook open on a board. Ruth called figures through the panel. Cow 11, estimated 920 pounds. Condition 2, Helen wrote them without comment. Cow 12, 880, condition 1 3/4. The weaker animals received a mark in the margin, not a larger dose guessed from concern. Weight governed dosing. The veterinarian collected manure samples from representative animals and sent them for fecal testing before directing parasite treatment. The results showed a heavy strongel-type egg count. That did not identify every parasite species by appearance, nor did one count explain every pound of lost condition, but it established that gastrointestinal parasites were part of the problem. Adult worms producing eggs could reduce feed efficiency, damage the digestive tract, and worsen the decline caused by inadequate forage. The veterinarian selected the treatment and directed dosing by estimated body weight. Ruth checked each calculation twice. Underdosing would not merely risk treatment failure in one animal. It could expose parasites to enough medication to spare the less susceptible individuals, encouraging resistance that would make the same drug less useful later. A 900-pound cow received the amount calculated for 900 pounds, not the amount that looked convenient on the syringe. An animal whose weight estimate fell between markings was handled according to the veterinarian's safety margin, with the product concentration read directly from the label. Ruth recorded every dose, identification number, and time. The animals left the chute into a separate paddock where clean water waited in a low tank scrubbed before their arrival. Water came first. Ruth walked the tank line twice that afternoon because a thin animal offered abundant dry feed without reliable water could not use it safely. The hay plan looked stingy to anyone accustomed to filling a bunk and leaving it full. Ruth used plain grass hay in small measured rounds, divided to reduce crowding and allow the rumen time to stabilize. There was no sudden grain surge. The animals needed fermentable fiber, water, mineral support matched to the forage tests, and gradual increases as appetite, manure consistency, and rumen function improved. Ruth watched manure as carefully as she watched the hay. Loose manure after transport could reflect stress, diet change, parasites, or several factors together. Dry scant manure could indicate low intake or poor water use. A return toward consistent, formed manure would not prove every problem solved, but it would show whether the feeding transition was moving in the right direction. Helen brought the brass hanging forage scale from the kitchen. Ruth filled a canvas sling with hay, hooked it beneath the scale, and waited for the pointer to settle. 32 pounds, Helen said. Ruth removed a handful. 30. Helen began a separate ledger without Ruth requesting it. On the first page, she wrote "Feed not bought" in plain block letters. Beneath that heading, she entered the amount of purchased hay Ruth had projected for a conventional holding period, then subtracted only what the herd actually consumed from the measured supply. She gave no credit for standing forage until it passed through a defined paddock, and Ruth could estimate utilization afterward. Helen would not place imagined savings into a ledger merely because the grass looked plentiful. "Count what the ground gives before you buy what the catalog sells," she said. Ruth hung the next sling. The weakest animals did not recover at the same rate. Several cows began moving toward hay promptly. Others waited at the edge of the group and approached only after larger animals shifted away. The bull drank, stood apart, and consumed his ration without testing the perimeter. One cow remained slow. She carried less flesh over the spine than the others and lowered her head toward the hay without taking a full mouth. Ruth adjusted the spacing between feeding points. The cow moved, sniffed, and stepped away. On the fourth day, Ruth found her standing near water with her ears level and her breathing steady. Her temperature did not show an obvious fever during the next safe examination, but her intake remained below the others. Ruth marked the page with a small square. The parasite treatment could reduce the burden. It could not instantly restore damaged tissue, correct every deficiency, or make a subordinate animal compete successfully at a crowded feeding point. Ruth continued the measured rounds. Hay increased gradually for animals whose manure and appetite stabilized. Mineral remained available in controlled locations protected from weather. Water tanks were cleaned and checked. The green notebook gained a line for each morning and evening. At the 14-day check, the veterinarian collected new manure samples for a fecal egg count comparison. The second count fell sharply, showing the treatment had worked against the susceptible egg-producing parasites present at the first test. Ruth drew a line beneath the result. She did not write "solved." The weak cow stood at the far end of the hay line, touched her nose to the measured allotment, and turned away. 14 days later, the second fecal count fell sharply, yet one cow still refused the measured hay allotment. The refusal narrowed the problem. The herd-level parasite burden was down, but the system could still fail one animal at a time, and one animal did not become less important because 39 others made the plan look better. Ruth brought the cow through the solid-sided approach with one quiet companion ahead of her. The veterinarian examined the mouth as far as restraint allowed, checked temperature, listened to the chest and abdomen, and reviewed the intake notes. There was no single dramatic finding waiting to explain everything. The cow was thin, stressed by competition, and slower to resume normal intake than the stronger adults. Forcing concentrate into the plan would have answered Ruth's worry more than the cow's needs. A sudden dense ration could disturb rumen conditions that were only beginning to stabilize. Instead, Ruth changed access. She built a recovery paddock beside the main group, close enough for visual contact but separated by a solid feeding arrangement. The weakest adults could eat without being displaced. Hay was offered in smaller amounts at more frequent intervals, with clean portions replacing trampled feed. Water distance was shortened. Ruth watched whether the refusing cow approached when the pressure of the larger group disappeared. On the second feeding after the move, the cow took 3 mouthfuls and stopped. Ruth wrote 3. At the next feeding, the cow ate for 4 minutes. Ruth wrote the time. By the following morning, the cow's manure remained sparse, but she approached the hay before Ruth left the paddock. Appetite returned by increments too small for anyone without a notebook to notice. The recovery paddock solved competition, but it increased Ruth's need to understand what the north ground could provide after purchased hay declined. Let me tell you about dormant grass, because you need to understand what remained in those stems before you can understand the winter budget. Most people saw coarse dormant stems and saw waste. Helen saw standing inventory. Switchgrass grew in warm season clumps with tall stems that held above moderate snow. Big bluestem carried much of its usable leaf below the seed heads, though weather stripped quality as winter advanced. Western wheatgrass, a cool season species, held shorter growth nearer the soil and offered a different pattern of availability. None of the three stayed nutritionally identical from autumn through spring. Brown did not mean empty. It also did not mean balanced. The stems contained structural carbohydrates, chiefly cellulose and hemicellulose, bound within plant tissue that rumen microbes could ferment. Lignin increased as plants matured and limited how much of that fiber could be digested. As digestibility fell, the time required to process each mouthful increased. An animal could stand inside abundant forage and still fail to consume enough usable energy if the stems were too mature, protein was too low, or weather made grazing costly. Ruth's forage tests guided what the range could not supply. She compared crude protein, fiber measures, and mineral results by pasture. Low protein could slow microbial reproduction in the rumen, which slowed fiber digestion and reduced intake. Mineral support therefore followed the tests rather than a general assumption that all range cattle or all bison needed the same sack from the co-op. Ruth did not credit every acre equally. Switchgrass on a protected slope counted differently from flattened stems in a drainage. Western wheatgrass beneath crusted snow counted only when the animals could reach it without spending more energy than the forage returned. Big bluestem near a water point received a heavier trampling allowance because animals would cross it repeatedly. Helen entered only measured use in feed not bought. On the first north paddock, Ruth set temporary interior strands inside the solid perimeter fence. The outer fence carried the real responsibility. It was built to contain an adult herd even if the electric system failed. The temporary strands were management tools, not wishful substitutes for a perimeter. Ruth used 2 visible electrified strands so the animals could see the boundary. Before asking portable fence to control daily moves, she trained the herd inside a smaller area where crossing an interior strand still left them enclosed by the solid fence. The first contacts were brief. A cow approached, touched the braid with her nose, recoiled, and moved away. Others learned by approaching the same visible line and receiving the same correction. Ruth kept the interior layout simple and checked voltage at the source, midpoint, and far end. The herd began to respect the braid. Within a week, Ruth could open a prepared paddock by moving one reel and closing another behind the adults after they crossed. Their movement was not perfectly orderly, but it followed forage rather than force. The bull crossed last, stopped once beside the opening, and continued when the cows ahead lowered their heads. The notebook filled with entry times, exit times, weather, estimated utilization, manure notes, and remaining standing height. Up to this point, Ruth had been controlling the sequence. That was about to flip. A wet south wind arrived overnight and softened the top inch of ground. Rain coated the dormant stems and laid green weeds against the lower electric braid. The temporary fence Ruth had assembled used a ground arrangement adequate on open, dry soil near the energizer, but the wet vegetation created hundreds of small leakage points along the line. Ruth checked the fence before sunrise. 2,100 volts. She tested again at the energizer, then at the midpoint. Voltage dropped sharply where wet plants touched the braid. The correction an animal received at that level was inconsistent, especially through heavy winter hair and damp footing. Ruth started clearing the first contact with a wooden handle. Behind her, one cow leaned into the interior line while reaching for grass beyond it. The braid touched hair along her shoulder. She hesitated but did not recoil. Her weight pushed the strand downward. A second cow followed. The braid slipped from one temporary post, sagged into wet vegetation, and the adult herd crossed. They did not leave Bellamy range. The solid perimeter held exactly as intended. But they entered a reserved paddock Ruth had planned to save until later, when the first grazed section needed rest and the standing forage elsewhere had declined. By the time Ruth closed a gate across the lane, the leading animals had spread through the reserve. Hooves flattened wet stems. Cows selected the easier leaf material first. The bull walked down the center and turned broadside near the far corner. Ruth did not chase them. Pressure would increase movement and trampling. She opened a controlled route back toward the recovery side, placed hay where the trained animals could see it, and waited. The first cow returned after 11 minutes. The others followed in uneven groups. The bull came last. The reserved paddock had been grazed too early. Ruth walked it that afternoon with the green notebook and a square frame of baling wire. She measured clipped areas, trampled areas, and stems left standing. The loss was not total, but the reserve no longer carried the amount entered in her winter sequence. She returned to the equipment shed after dark. Rain ticked against the metal roof. The green notebook lay open beside the fence tester, and for the first time since Warren's offer, Ruth wrote a number she had caused rather than predicted. 2,100 volts. The failure was electrical, but the mistake was not simply a weak energizer. A fence circuit depended on current traveling from the energizer through the live strand, through the animal or vegetation to earth, and back through the grounding system. Poor grounding restricted that return path. Wet vegetation drew current continuously, turning every touching stem into a small drain. Ruth had too little ground contact for the load and too much vegetation against the lower braid. She could remove the wet grass and raise the strand, but unless the ground system improved, another damp morning would reproduce the same failure. Ruth listed the repair costs: 3 galvanized ground rods, each 6 feet long, clamps, insulated lead wire, 1 additional cutout switch. The purchase stayed inside the fencing allowance because she had used salvaged corner posts elsewhere. At first light, she drove the rods into moist soil 10 feet apart near the energizer, leaving enough exposed for secure clamps. Each rod connected to the next with continuous ground wire. She cleaned every connection until bare metal met bare metal, tightened the clamps, and protected the lead where it crossed the shed wall. Then she walked the entire temporary line with a sickle, cutting wet stems away from the braid. She raised the lower strand where ground contour brought it too close to vegetation and replaced the temporary post that had released under pressure. Helen followed at a distance, carrying the brass scale and a paper sack for forage samples. Her short, deliberate steps left narrow prints in the damp soil. At the far end, Ruth connected the fence tester, 6,800 volts. She returned to the energizer, cleaned 1 final corroded clip and tested again, 7,100 volts. Ruth wrote the number beneath the failure entry. She did not cross out 2,100. The lower figure explained why the reserve had been entered early, and removing it would only make the next plan weaker. Helen stood beside the repaired line with the pale oval birthmark visible on the back of her right hand as she held the scale. Count what the ground gives before you buy what the catalog sells. Ruth looked across the partially grazed reserve. We count what they took, too. Helen opened the feed not bought ledger and reduced the standing inventory credit for that paddock. The subtraction was larger than Ruth wanted. It was also honest. The refusing cow continued eating in the recovery paddock, though her body condition did not rise quickly. 6 other cows remained weak enough that breeding would place unnecessary demand on reserves they had not restored. Pregnancy and later milk production required nutrients that a thin animal could not supply without sacrificing more condition. Ruth reviewed all 34 adult cows by identification number. She compared arrival scores, estimated weights, appetite, manure, treatment response, and movement through the paddocks. The green notebook held no column titled Hope. It held condition and change. 7 cows remained below the threshold Ruth had written before the herd arrived. She moved those 7 into the recovery group, where forage access and measured support could continue without breeding exposure. The decision reduced the first breeding group to 27 adult cows. It also reduced the number of possible offspring anyone might reserve the following year, though no waiting list yet existed and no neighbor had offered a deposit. The adult bull stood on the opposite side of a solid gate while Ruth checked the latch twice. The 27 cows occupied the prepared breeding paddock. The 7 weaker cows remained together near the recovery hay, including the one that had first refused her allotment. The repaired electric strands clicked at steady intervals through the damp evening. Ruth tested the far end once more, watched the display hold, and recorded the figure in the green notebook. With the fence holding at 7,100 volts, Ruth divided the 7 weakest cows from the breeding group. The separation did not mean those 7 cows had failed. It meant Ruth refused to make fertility carry more weight than the animals themselves could bear. Conception in a severely depleted cow could deepen the deficit that already showed over her ribs and spine. Gestation would raise nutrient requirements, and milk production would raise them again. If forage quality fell while those demands climbed, the cow would pull from tissue she had not yet restored. A pregnancy obtained by forcing that sequence would not prove the range worked. It would prove only that Ruth had asked too much before the bill came due. Fertility was data. It was not a prize to force. Ruth wrote 27 identification numbers on the exposure page, checked each against the condition records, and drew a firm line beneath the last one. The 7 withheld cows had their own page. So did the 5 yearling females, which were too young for the breeding decision Ruth was testing with the adults. The bulls' exposure dates went beside the 27 cows and nowhere else. Ruth checked gates every morning, counted every animal at water, and used the repaired electric divisions to prevent an accidental change in the trial. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you saw someone make a plan stronger by deliberately producing less? That was what Ruth's 27-cow limit did. It reduced the highest possible production on paper, but it removed 7 compromised cows from a demand they were not ready to meet. The smaller number made every later result easier to read. If condition improved, Ruth could connect that improvement to measured forage, controlled breeding pressure, and recovery time. If it declined, she would know the range had not supplied what her calculations promised. She returned to the paddock before the morning light had cleared the cottonwoods. Let me tell you about residual height, because you need to understand what Ruth left behind before you can understand what she allowed the herd to take. A grazed pasture was not measured by whether the animals had found something to eat. Ruth needed to know how much leaf and stem remained, how evenly the animals had used the cell, and whether the plants retained enough material to support regrowth. She crossed each paddock with measured heel-first steps, the faded olive chore coat brushing the tops of the dormant stems, and dropped the baling wire frame at intervals selected before she entered. Within each square she estimated grazed plants, ungrazed plants, trampled material, bare soil, and manure coverage. She clipped sample areas to a consistent height, placed the forage in marked paper sacks, and weighed the dried portions with Helen's brass hanging scale. Ruth did not pretend the clipped square represented every foot of 640 acres. She used enough samples to catch the difference between ridges, swales, water approaches, and protected slopes. The herd moved before any cell looked clean. A clean-looking paddock usually meant the easiest plants had been bitten repeatedly while rougher stems remained, and that kind of selection could weaken the plants Ruth needed most. She moved the animals while leaf material remained above her written residual target. The next cell opened ahead of them. The previous one closed behind. Water placement changed the grazing pattern as much as temporary fence did. When the tank remained near one corner, manure accumulated around that corner, hoof traffic pressed the soil, and the distant edge went lightly used. Ruth therefore shifted portable water access where the ground and plumbing allowed, then recorded the distance from water to the farthest forage. She watched trails form. She moved mineral away from the tank to draw animals through areas they otherwise crossed without stopping. Manure distribution widened over the summer, though it never became perfectly even. Ruth marked heavy concentrations instead of averaging them out of existence. Every Saturday, the adult cows passed close enough for Ruth to update body condition records without unnecessary restraint. She watched the cover over the spine, ribs, hooks, pins, and tail head. Winter hair could deceive at a glance, so she compared posture, movement, fill, and known identification records. The 7 withheld cows improved by different increments. The cow that had refused hay gained slowly, but the sharp line along her spine softened. Ruth added no extra credit for effort. The score moved only when the body changed. The 27 exposed cows held or gained condition through early summer. That mattered, but Ruth kept the claim narrow. Their later offspring would not become genetically superior because their dams had once gone hungry. Starvation improved no bloodline. What buyers might eventually value was the record behind each maternal line, an adult cow that arrived depleted, regained condition under measured low-input management, and returned to fertility without a grain-heavy program concealing whether the ground could support her. The distinction belonged in the notebook. Ruth wrote it in plain words and underlined nothing. June rain lifted the western wheatgrass. July heat favored the warm season stands where root reserves and spring moisture remained adequate. Ruth lengthened rest periods as growth slowed because a calendar could not tell a plant when it had recovered. She checked new leaf development at the base of grazed tillers. If a paddock had not rebuilt enough leaf area, it stayed closed. Up to this point, Ruth had been correcting one problem at a time. That was about to flip. The last useful rain fell during the first week of August. By the end of the month, the upper soil had dried hard enough that Ruth's boot heel left only a pale mark. Switchgrass seed heads remained upright, but regrowth beneath them shortened. Western wheatgrass stopped replacing the leaf area taken in the previous rotation. Water use increased as the days stayed hot, and the trails around the tanks widened. Ruth extended the recovery period, which protected the grazed cells but concentrated the herd's demand on fewer available acres. She opened one reserve earlier than planned, then reduced the projected winter credit for that ground. Helen made the same subtraction in feed not bought. Neither woman argued with the arithmetic. The hay stack gave Ruth the next warning. She counted bales by row, checked average weight from the purchase tickets and sample weighings, then applied the waste rate she had observed rather than the lower rate she had projected in March. Wind loss, trampling, rejected weathered edges, and the recovery group's smaller frequent feedings had consumed more than the original line allowed. The reserve stood 23 bales below projection. Ruth called 3 hay sellers. The nearest had already committed his better grass hay. The second quoted a price $12 per ton above spring, with delivery available only if he could combine the load with another stop. The third had hay, but winter freight from his yard to Bellamy Range added $468 to the load Ruth calculated she might need. Fuel had risen, trucks were booked, and nobody owed her a March price in September. She recalculated the full winter 3 ways. The first assumed average weather and measured grazing through the dates already written. The second added a prolonged cold period and greater hay use. The third assumed she sold the herd before winter tightened, recovered what the market would allow, and stopped exposing the family to a plan whose margin had narrowed. At 2 in the morning, Ruth sat alone beneath the equipment shed light. Her straight chestnut brown braid lay over the back of the faded olive chore coat, and the thin oval steel glasses had slipped low on her narrow nose. The green notebook rested beside the fence tester. Rain had once ticked against that roof while she repaired a mistake. Now dry wind pushed dust beneath the door. She entered the freight quote, the reduced pasture credit, and the higher waste rate. Beneath them she ruled a sale column. She knew what a full resale might return if Warren's former herd looked better than it had in March. She also knew buyers could discount thin history, uneven condition, and an unproven breeding record. A sale would end the winter risk. It would preserve cash. It would also stop the test before the ground had answered the question that began it. Ruth held the pencil above the first empty line for 11 minutes. At 2 in the morning, Ruth closed the notebook over a blank sale column and considered ending the experiment before winter. The blank sale column remained under Ruth's hand until she noticed Helen's separate ledger beside it. Helen had left feed not bought on the shelf near the brass forage scale after the evening weighing. The ledger was thinner than Ruth's notebook, with a black cloth spine and squared pages. Ruth opened it expecting the same dwindling reserve she had just calculated. The first entry began with the conventional hay estimate Helen had refused to treat as a fact. Each later page showed what Ruth actually fed, what a weighed bale supplied, what remained after waste, and how many days the herd occupied a measured grazing cell. Helen had not credited standing forage when Ruth opened a gate. She credited it only after the animals left. The residual had been measured, and Ruth's condition records showed the feed had maintained or improved the adults using it. Let me tell you about the ledger because you need to understand the avoided expense before you can understand the proof. Ruth had watched daily problems so closely that she had missed the accumulated result. One paddock had displaced only 4 days of hay. Another had displaced 9. The early reserve failure reduced the next credit, and the dry August rotation reduced another. But the numbers continued across the pages. Controlled grazing had replaced more purchased hay than the lost bales and higher freight quote would consume. Helen had converted each avoided feeding period into dry matter rather than counting days as if summer and winter intake were identical. A bale's painted weight was not enough. Ruth and Helen had weighed samples, estimated moisture, and recorded refusals. A 1,000-pound bale did not place 1,000 pounds of usable dry matter inside the animals. Water contributed weight. Weathering and trampling removed more. Coarse stems rejected at the feeding site remained feed purchased but not consumed. Ruth reopened the green notebook. She recalculated from the ground up. Actual bale weights replaced the seller's nominal average. Dry matter estimates replaced as-fed weight where the forage tests allowed it. Pasture days counted only after measured utilization. Waste rates came from gathered refusals and feeding site observations. Weekly body condition trends served as a check against false economy, because a reduced hay bill meant nothing if adult cows paid for it with lost tissue. The arithmetic did not erase the drought. It changed the decision. Ruth needed more hay than she had hoped, but less than the 2 in the morning sale calculation assumed. She accepted the combined load delivery from the second seller, which reduced freight by sharing the route. She did not fill the yard with an unrestricted winter supply purchased on fear. She bought the measured bridge between standing forage expected intake and the safety reserve required for bad weather. Helen entered the amount without looking pleased. Count what the ground gives before you buy what the catalog sells. Ruth turned the blank sale column into a contingency page. The first trigger was body condition loss beyond the limit written beside each management group. The second was water failure. The third was a hay reserve falling beneath the days required to cover severe weather. If any trigger appeared, Ruth would act before concern became an emergency. Quitting remained possible. Guessing did not. The severe cold arrived in January. A north wind drove fine snow across the pasture until the lower stems disappeared behind hard ribs of drift. The temperature stayed below zero through 2 nights, and the wind increased the energy required to maintain body heat. Dormant forage still stood on the protected slopes, but access and intake mattered more than the number of stems visible from the road. Ruth shortened the grazing cells. A smaller cell reduced the distance the herd traveled while searching and prevented the animals from wandering over broad acreage for scattered mouthfuls. She selected areas with wind protection and standing forage above the shallow drift. The temporary lines were checked for voltage after frost altered the ground connection. The solid perimeter carried the containment load. Water became the narrow point. Ice formed where moving water splashed against the tank edge. Ruth cleared it before the drinking surface narrowed enough to create competition. She checked the supply line at dawn, noon, and after dark. Snow could contribute water, but she would not assume every adult consumed enough snow to replace reliable access, especially when cold already raised maintenance demands. Hay served as a bridge rather than an open bunk. Ruth weighed the allotments with Helen's brass hanging scale, adjusted for the greater maintenance demand, and distributed them across enough feeding points to prevent weaker cows from being displaced. The bridge ration gave the rumen consistent fiber while standing forage contributed what the animals could safely harvest. Ruth increased hay when the cold held, but she recorded every pound. Restriction for its own sake would have been as foolish as waste. The bull came through the cold holding condition. The 27 exposed cows remained within Ruth's written limits. The 7 withheld cows, managed with easier access and closer observation, continued their slower recovery. The one that had once eaten 3 mouthfuls at a time now approached the feeding line with the others, though Ruth still gave her space at the edge. When the wind dropped, Ruth did not immediately return the herd to the longer rotation. Packed snow and trampled feeding areas changed access. She walked the next cell first, broke the crust with her boot, and checked whether the cows could reach leaf material without scraping for every mouthful. Only then did she move the line. The pregnancy examination took place after the cold spell eased. Ruth prepared the solid-sided lane, removed the loose objects that could strike a panel, and checked the gate latch 12 times as she had before. The veterinarian reviewed the exposure list before the first cow entered. There were 27 adult cows in that count. The 7 withheld cows were not failures, open cows, or missing results. They had never been exposed. The 5 yearling females also remained outside the count. Each exposed cow passed through the chute with restraint kept as brief and quiet as possible. Ruth stood by the identification panel with the green notebook open. Helen waited outside the lane, brown cat-eye reading glasses resting low on her gently hooked nose, and held the record board against her burgundy cardigan. The first confirmation received a small green mark, so did the second. The 6th cow was not confirmed. Ruth entered the result and moved on. By the end of the examination, 24 of the 27 exposed adult cows were confirmed pregnant. 3 were not. Ruth reviewed the 3 open cow records before making any decision about them. One result did not establish why conception had not occurred. Exposure timing, individual fertility, condition, reproductive health, and bull performance all required consideration. She scheduled the appropriate follow-up instead of turning an incomplete result into a story. The whole herd count came next. 34 adult cows, 5 yearling females, and 1 bull remained on Bellamy Range. All 40 adults were accounted for. The weakest group had regained enough condition to remain in the rehabilitation plan. No death had been hidden inside a percentage. No animal had vanished into an average. Ruth carried the cost pages to the kitchen table where the brass forage scale hung beside Helen's chair. The purchase had cost $800. Hauling had cost $312. Veterinary work had cost $186.40. Hay had cost $1,104. Mineral had cost $128.60. Fencing had cost $438.75. Chute parts had cost $74.20. Together, acquisition and rehabilitation setup had cost $3,043.95. Ruth's original ceiling had been $3,850. The difference was $806.05. The freight increase and cold weather hay use had narrowed several categories, but salvaged posts, controlled forage use, and measured feeding kept actual spending beneath the ceiling. Helen checked the subtraction twice. Count what the ground gives before you buy what the catalog sells. Ruth uncapped a green pen and wrote 24 confirmed pregnancies beside the exposure list. The winter closed with all 40 adults accounted for, 24 confirmed pregnancies, and $806.05 left beneath Ruth's projected ceiling. 24 confirmed pregnancies turned Ruth's private forage experiment into something neighboring ranchers could price. The number alone did not do it. Dale Albrecht saw the pages behind it. He arrived at Bellamy Range on a February afternoon carrying a folded mineral order and the red carpenter's pencil in his blue chambray shirt pocket. His square black-framed glasses had fogged when he stepped from the cold into the barn. Ruth set the winter ledger on an overturned feed bin and returned to repairing a waterline bracket. She did not present the result as a triumph. Dale read the exposure list first. He counted 27 names, then checked the 24 confirmations. He turned to the 7 withheld cows and the 5 yearling females, making sure Ruth had not folded unexposed animals into the result to improve the appearance of the rate. He read the body condition pages from arrival through winter. The pale marks over both ears reddened as the barn warmed. What did they eat in January? Ruth handed him the weighed hay page. Dale compared it with the pasture entries in Helen's feed not bought ledger. He had managed the Morrow Co-op long enough to recognize a feed figure made tidy after the fact. Helen's ledger was not tidy. It contained reduced credits, wasted hay, extra cold weather allotments, and the early reserve loss. That untidiness made it useful. The adult cows stood beyond the barn in the protected lot. Dale watched them through the opening. Their winter coats remained thick, but the condition notes told him what hair concealed. The weakest adults had improved. The exposed group had held through cold. The bull moved evenly and did not stand hollow behind the ribs. Dale returned tomorrow with the mineral order and 3 figures written on the back of his folded paper. By the time Ruth collected fence staples 2 days later, Warren Pike had heard the first version. By supper, 2 ranchers from the southern part of Custer County had asked Dale whether Ruth intended to sell any offspring from the confirmed maternal lines. Let me tell you about what those ranchers were asking for, because you need to understand the record before you can understand the price. They were not asking for a guarantee that every animal from Bellamy Range would thrive on every piece of ground. They wanted offspring from maternal lines whose adult cows had entered in poor condition, regained flesh under documented management, conceived without a grain-heavy winter ration, and held condition through cold. The offspring remained future entries in a notebook. Ruth promised no color, temperament, mature weight, or performance she could not yet document. She knew 24 pregnancies had been confirmed, but confirmation did not guarantee 24 transferable animals. Pregnancy loss, health, sex, condition, and retention decisions could reduce the number available. Therefore, she offered 20 reservations and stopped there. The price was $675 each. A reservation required a deposit of $75, dated and receipted. The remaining $600 would be due only if Ruth had an animal meeting the written transfer conditions. Deposits would be returned if she could not fill a reservation in order. There would be no replacement from a weaker line merely to keep the money. Warren requested 2. A grass operator east of Morrow requested 3. 2 brothers who managed separate acreages requested 4 between them. The remaining requests came in 1s and 2s until 11 ranchers had asked for all 20 available reservations. 20 deposits of $75 placed $1,500 in the Bellamy account. The contracted gross value, if all 20 transfers were completed, was $13,500. Ruth entered both figures on separate lines. Deposits were cash held against obligations. They were not completed sales. She wrote the maternal identification beside each reservation only after the record allowed it. Where no specific line could yet be assigned, she wrote pending. The green notebook began to carry names outside the family for the first time. Exactly 1 year after Warren Pike accepted $800 for 40 underfed adult bison, Dale returned to the Bellamy barn alone. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he did not laugh. He stood chest forward beside the overturned feed bin, removed his square black-framed glasses, and cleaned them with the inside edge of his tan canvas vest. Ruth waited with the green notebook under one hand. Helen stood near the brass-hanging scale, the compact freckle cluster at her left temple visible above the rim of her brown cat-eye glasses. Dale looked at the 20 paid reservation lines, the condition records, and the page showing 24 confirmed pregnancies. His red carpenter's pencil remained in his pocket. I was wrong. 3 words, no decoration. The admission cost him because his standing in Morrow came from being careful before other people spent money. He had laughed when Ruth described the plan, and 11 ranchers had relied partly on his later reading of her records when they placed deposits. He could have softened it by saying the weather helped, the price was unusual, or Ruth had been lucky to find Warren when she did. Some of those things contained pieces of fact. None changed what he had said in the co-op office. Ruth closed the notebook halfway. Dale put his glasses back on. The platform scale is empty Saturday mornings. The co-op scale could provide consistent weights without Ruth purchasing equipment she did not yet need. Dale offered its use without charge before opening hours, when truck traffic would be light and the approach could be managed quietly. He would check the platform, clear loose chains and bright debris near the lane, and provide printed weight tickets for Ruth's records. He did more than lend the scale. He took a clean co-op order book, copied every reservation by deposit date, and assigned each a sequence number. Where 2 deposits arrived on the same day, he used the time written on Ruth's receipt copy. He placed no friend ahead of another and moved no larger buyer over a smaller one. Helen turned 1 page in feed not bought. You were right to count it. She said it without looking up, then entered the cost avoided by using the co-op platform scale instead of renting a portable unit. Ruth's face did not change. She checked Dale's order against her receipts. 1 line remained beneath the 11 ranchers. Dale removed the red carpenter's pencil, wrote his own name, and dated it. He did not offer a deposit for one of the 20 already assigned. He requested the next available place after Ruth knew what the herd could produce without weakening its measured growth. On March 9, 1994, 20 reservation lines carried deposits, and Dale wrote his own name beneath 11 others. Dale's name beneath 11 others made the waiting list real, but Ruth still had to deliver without weakening the herd. A contracted gross figure could tempt a person to treat every available animal as inventory. Ruth treated the range, the adult cows, and the condition records as the limits. The 1994 production page eventually carried 23 completed offspring records. Ruth did not count a pregnancy as production, and she did not count an incomplete health record as transferable. 20 animals met the contract conditions and were transferred in reservation order. 3 females were retained for measured herd growth. They remained entries in the green notebook, connected to maternal identification, weight tickets, health work, and the pasture allocation required to carry them forward. The 20 completed sales at $675 each produced $13,500 in gross revenue. Against that stood the original $800 purchase and the acquisition and rehabilitation setup total of $3,043.95. Ruth did not subtract the purchase twice. The $800 was already included within the full setup figure. After the transfers, she separated operating costs, taxes, pasture expenses, and the cash reserve before considering expansion. The gross figure did not become spendable merely because it appeared in the receipt column. Let me tell you about the order in which Ruth used the money, because you need to understand what she refused to finance before you can understand how the herd grew. The first dollars went into perimeter fence, not decorative fence, and not temporary divisions pretending to be containment. She replaced weak corners, deepened braces where soil movement had loosened posts, added visible wire where approach angles made the existing strands difficult to see, and improved gates along the handling route. The next dollars went into water. Ruth extended buried line to reduce haul distance, installed shutoffs that allowed one damaged section to be isolated without draining the whole system, and protected risers from hoof pressure. She placed tanks according to grazing distribution rather than convenience alone. Shorter distance to reliable water reduced trail concentration and allowed cells to be drawn around forage instead of around one permanent tank. Only after perimeter and water did Ruth lease more pasture. The lease had to add measured forage at a price below the feed it displaced, with access and fence responsibilities written plainly. She did not lease acres because the herd had become valuable. She leased usable forage after testing what those acres could produce. She financed no speculative feed. Helen's brass scale continued to settle beneath canvas slings. The green notebook continued to record residual height, body condition, exposure, and actual transfers. Feed not bought gained new pages, but Helen never credited leased grass until Ruth's measurements showed the animals had used it without losing condition. For 1995, Ruth allowed expansion only after the retained females, adult cows, and pasture reserve fit the winter calculation. The completed sales count rose to 25. At $700 each, those transfers produced $17,500 in gross revenue. The price increase was $25 per animal, supported by another year of condition histories, weight records from the co-op platform, and completed reservation order. Ruth did not raise it because demand alone would tolerate more. She calculated the added fence, water, veterinary, handling, and pasture costs required to deliver the same standard as the operation grew. Dale opened the platform scale before sunrise on selected Saturdays. He carried the red carpenter's pencil and a stack of blank weight tickets, checked that the deck was clear, and recorded the sequence without commentary. His name advanced on the waiting list only when earlier deposits had been filled or released. He asked for no exception. The 1995 revenue repaired another perimeter stretch and completed a water extension to the leased ground. Ruth walked the line herself, chestnut brown braids centered between the shoulders of her olive chore coat, tapping clamps and testing voltage at the far end. One corroded connection produced a lower reading. She cleaned it to bare metal and tested again before any interior division opened. In 1996, 34 completed sales at $725 each produced $24,650. Ruth reconciled the figure in the green notebook by writing 34 separate receipt numbers. Helen carried the total into a larger ledger because Feed Not Bought had outgrown the first cloth-bound book, though she kept the original volume on the kitchen shelf. The title remained the same. That year, Ruth altered the grazing sequence after spring moisture-concentrated growth on the lower ground. She did not average the abundance across the whole range. Protected slopes carried one amount. Upland warm season stands carried another. The leased pasture entered the rotation later because its root reserves had been strained before Ruth took it. Revenue could buy access to land. It could not purchase a year of plant recovery after the fact. The 3 retained females from the first production year became part of the measured herd only as their age, condition, and forage allocation allowed. Ruth attached no value to them in the sale ledger because they had not been sold. Their cost appeared in forage demand and health work. Their future contribution remained blank until it occurred. By the end of 1996, the family debt that had stood at $38,700 when Ruth began had declined, but she refused to empty the operations reserve merely to make the balance disappear faster on paper. Fence failure, water damage, drought, and winter freight did not wait politely because a debt payment felt satisfying. Helen agreed, provided every reserved dollar had a named purpose and a date for review. In 1997, 43 completed sales at $750 each produced $32,250. The waiting list lengthened, but Ruth kept transfers tied to what the adult herd and measured forage could support. She could have retained more females, leased more ground at a higher price, and purchased feed to bridge the difference. Instead, She retained only the number whose future dry matter demand fit the pasture plan after a bad weather allowance. The restraint irritated one prospective buyer who wanted 6 places moved ahead in exchange for paying the full amount immediately. Ruth stood evenly balanced beside the kitchen table, thin oval steel glasses catching the window light, and slid his check back across the wood. "The order is by deposit date." He took the check. 2 weeks later he returned with the proper deposits for later positions. Helen entered the dates. The perimeter fence expanded in sections paid from completed revenue. Each new water line followed after pressure, flow, winter exposure, and shutoff placement had been checked. Pasture leases followed water. Ruth did not reverse that order. Ground without containment and reliable water was acreage on a map, not carrying capacity. The green notebook wore through at the fold. Ruth reinforced it with cloth tape rather than replacing it, because the first body condition pages, the 2,100-volt failure, the repaired 7,100-volt reading, and the blank sale column belonged beside the later figures. She added a second green notebook for current work but kept the original within reach. Helen's brass hanging scale developed a dull shine where hands held the ring. Its spring remained reliable within the working range because Helen checked it against known weights. If the pointer failed to return to 0, she adjusted it before another sling was credited. An uncorrected scale error repeated across hundreds of feed measurements could create a false saving larger than a single wasted bale. In 1998, the operation entered its 6th grazing season with more perimeter, better distributed water, additional leased forage, and a waiting list that extended beyond one production year. Demand no longer surprised anyone at the Morrow Co-op. Dale kept reservation copies in a locked drawer, organized by deposit date, and gave Ruth the stack whenever she reconciled completed transfers. The count for the year reached 51 sales. At $775 each, gross revenue was $39,525. Ruth checked the multiplication by grouping 50 sales at $775, which made $38,750, then adding one more sale at $775. Helen checked it another way. The money moved in the same order it had before. Perimeter fence received the first allocation. Water lines received the second. Pasture leases received the third. Veterinary work, mineral matched to forage tests, handling repairs, and the operating reserve each received their own ledger lines. Grain debt received nothing because Ruth had never created it. That did not mean the bison consumed no purchased forage or supplement. Hay remained a measured bridge when standing forage could not safely meet demand. Mineral-filled deficiencies shown by tests and management records. Veterinary treatment followed need. Ruth's rule concerned debt taken to purchase recurring feed for speculative growth. If an added animal required borrowed feed before the ground could carry it, that animal did not fit the expansion. Feed not bought therefore remained an avoided expense ledger, not a claim that the herd lived on air. Helen subtracted purchased hay, waste, freight, lease expense, water repair, and every cost required to make the grazing system function. Ruth valued the ledger because it argued with her. A page that only confirmed the plan would have been useless. At the final reconciliation of 1998, Helen sat upright at the kitchen table in her burgundy wool cardigan, the pale oval birthmark on the back of her right hand visible beside the black cloth spine. Ruth stood across from her with the original green notebook open to the first winter. The brass forage scale hung between them. Helen entered 51 completed sales, each at $775, and drew the year's closing line. Beneath feed financing, she wrote 0. By the end of 1998, Helen's ledger shows 51 sales at $775 each and no grain debt. That 0 mattered more than the 51 sales, though its value would not become visible until prices began falling. Up to this point, Ruth had been expanding into a rising market. That was about to flip. Let me tell you about the market Bellamy Range entered in 1999. Because you need to understand what falling prices reveal that rising prices can hide. For several years, breeding animals had moved through sales at figures supported partly by production, and partly by the belief that another buyer would pay more later. New operators borrowed against land, trucks, handling equipment, and animals purchased near the top. Some bought feed before they had tested their ground. Others treated the resale value of breeding stock as though it were stored cash. The animals remained real. The prices attached to them did not. When speculative bison prices collapsed in 1999, buyers who had reserved animals at Bellamy Range began calling Ruth before their transfer dates. 4 requested smaller numbers. 3 asked whether deposits could be moved into the next year. One rancher from western Kansas arrived with his receipt and admitted that his bank had withdrawn the operating line he expected to use for fencing. Ruth returned each deposit that could not be completed under the written terms. She moved no later buyer ahead without recording the change, and she did not pressure anyone to take an animal merely because a reservation existed. An animal transferred to ground without secure fence, dependable water, or adequate forage would become another distressed animal later. Dale kept the order book open on the Morrow co-op counter after closing time. His sandy gray mustache shifted as he read each change, but he offered no complaint about the lost volume. "The list will be shorter," he said. "It should be," Ruth answered. Bellamy Range completed 47 low-input breeding sales in 1999. The price had fallen to $610 each, producing $28,670 in gross revenue. That was $10,855 less than the previous year, despite the operation transferring only 4 fewer animals. Helen entered the reduction without changing the order of spending. Perimeter repairs came first, water maintenance came second, pasture access came third. The reserve remained intact. Expansion stopped until Ruth could recalculate the value of every retained female against a lower expected sale price. The lower price changed more than revenue. It changed which acres made sense to lease, how much fence improvement a retained animal could justify, and how long Bellamy Range could carry an animal that failed to meet transfer conditions. Ruth rebuilt the projections using $600 as the expected sale value, then tested them at $550. The green notebook held both columns. She did not use the old price because she preferred it. The market weakened again in 2000. Ruth completed 45 sales at $590 each, producing $26,550. The adult breeding herd remained on land whose cost had not been inflated by the market peak. Its growth had come through retained females supported by measured forage, not through large purchases of expensive breeding animals. The operation carried no note against speculative stock, and Helen's ledger still showed no borrowed grain money. That did not make the decline painless. Ruth postponed a planned handling building addition and repaired the existing alley with used pipe, new fasteners, and labor exchanged with 2 neighboring operators. She replaced only the bent sections that changed the animal's path or created a pressure point. Cosmetic rust stayed where it was. A new building would have cost $9,400. The repair used $612.30 in pipe, $118.40 in fasteners, $96 in welding gas and rod, and 2 days of exchanged labor. Cash cost totaled $826.70. Helen entered $8,573.30 under feed not bought, crossed out the word feed, and wrote building not borrowed above that one line. Ruth looked at the alteration. Helen adjusted her brown cat-eye reading glasses. The ledger can count more than hay. By 2001, weak prices had removed much of the speculative demand. The buyers still waiting wanted animals whose records could reduce uncertainty on actual grass. Ruth's reservation terms became more detailed, not more flattering. She included maternal identification, recent body condition history, completed health work, age, weight ticket sequence, and the limits of what Bellamy Range could claim. She would document performance on her ground. She would not promise another ranch the same rainfall, soil depth, mineral profile, or management. That year, 52 sales at $650 each produced $33,800. It was the first increase in annual gross sales revenue since 1998, but Ruth did not reopen rapid expansion. Rainfall had become uneven, the warm season stands entered dormancy earlier on exposed ground, and several water points took longer to recover after heavy use. She shortened occupation periods and increased recovery where plant response allowed it. A pasture cell was not ready merely because the calendar said enough days had passed. Ruth checked growing points, leaf area, soil cover, and whether preferred species had begun replacing root reserves. Where regrowth remained weak, the herd moved elsewhere or hay entered the calculation. The first warning for 2002 came before winter had released its hold. The soil profile carried too little stored moisture. Spring rain arrived in narrow tracks, wetting one township while leaving another under dust. By June, Ruth could push a soil probe into low ground, but upland sites resisted it after the first few inches. The grazing map began to lose cells. You know what the 2002 drought did to operations that borrowed to expand into a falling livestock market? It made every obligation arrive at once. Lenders demanded payments on breeding animals worth less than their purchase notes. Leased pasture disappeared when owners chose to stock it themselves, sell it, or demand more rent from anyone desperate enough to pay. Purchased hay climbed as local supplies tightened and freight distance increased. Operators who had financed herds near the market peak had to liquidate animals into weak prices, which pushed those prices lower while leaving the debt behind. At Bellamy Range, Ruth stood in the equipment shed after dark with the second green notebook open on a workbench. Her chestnut-brown braid lay against the back of the faded olive chore coat. The thin oval steel glasses sat low on her narrow straight nose while she compared standing forage, contracted transfers, breeding females, and hay available within trucking distance. Up to this point, Ruth had been controlling the rate of growth. That was about to flip. The drought had begun controlling the amount of ground. Ruth reduced every grazing allocation to what she could verify. She opened no cell because green color looked encouraging from the gate. She walked transects, clipped sample areas, dried representative forage, and converted the measured weight into usable dry matter only after accounting for the portion that had to remain for plant recovery, soil cover, trampling, and wildlife. A field could contain forage without containing forage available for removal. The numbers required hay. Emergency hay cost Bellamy Range $18,432 in 2002. Ruth purchased it in scheduled loads rather than chasing the lowest advertised price. She compared delivered cost per ton, moisture, waste, usable dry matter, and storage loss. A cheaper load carrying excess moisture or coarse material the herd would sort could cost more per pound actually consumed. Helen weighed sample flakes on the brass hanging forage scale. Her ash-brown hair, threaded with more silver now, remained in its smooth low bun as she checked the pointer before each measurement. If a bale averaged 1,200 pounds but 8% was lost to handling and refusal, Ruth did not credit the full weight to intake. The missing 96 pounds still appeared on the invoice. It simply did not feed an animal. Ruth protected the breeding herd, but she did not protect every planned sale. Contracted animals were transferred only when the receiving ground was ready and Bellamy Range could complete the transfer without compromising health. Buyers who had lost pasture received deposits back. Retained growth was reduced. Ruth carried no animal merely to preserve the appearance of expansion. 49 contracted transfers were completed at $625 each, producing $30,625 in gross revenue. Emergency hay consumed $18,432 of that figure before veterinary work, mineral, fence repair, taxes, leases, hauling, or labor were considered. The margin was narrow. For one night in August, Ruth considered selling a block of breeding females before the next hay loads arrived. She sat alone beneath the shed light with the original green notebook beside the current one. Warren Pike's $800 bill of sale remained folded inside the back cover. On another page, 40 underfed adults had once stood against 640 acres of coarse grass. Selling females would preserve cash and reduce immediate demand, but it would also release proven maternal lines into the same weak market that was already forcing distressed sales. Buying comparable animals later would cost money, health uncertainty, and years of records. Ruth counted the hay already contracted, the forage protected for fall use, the water still dependable, and the reserve Helen had refused to spend for appearances. She closed the sale column without writing a number. The next morning, Ruth paid for the scheduled hay from cash. There was no feed note for a lender to call because there had never been one. There was no inflated breeding stock loan secured by animals whose market value had collapsed because Bellamy Range had grown the adult herd from retained production. The ground was dry, the market was weak, and the invoices were heavy, but none of those facts gave another party a claim on the breeding herd. Helen entered the last hay invoice in black ink. She made no claim that the system had avoided feed. The ledger showed $18,432 spent because refusing necessary hay would have destroyed the asset the ground could support again after rain returned. "Count what the ground gives before you buy what the catalog sells," she said. That year, the ground gave less. Therefore they bought what was required and nothing beyond it. At the end of the 2002 drought, Bellamy Range still owns its breeding herd, owes nothing on feed, and has 49 contracted transfers completed. The drought ledger ends in black ink, and that survival attracts someone from beyond Custer County. Let me tell you about the person who noticed the drought ledger, because you need to understand why Bellamy Range finally traveled farther than feed store talk. In the spring of 2005, a writer from Range Stock Quarterly drove into Morrow after hearing 3 different versions of the same claim. One said Ruth Bellamy had carried a full breeding herd through drought without feeding hay. Another said she had never lost an animal. A third said Bellamy Range had made more money during the collapse than it had during the market peak. All 3 versions were wrong. The writer was a white Anglo-American man in his 40s with mud dried along the lower doors of his sedan and a legal pad on the passenger seat. He reached the Bellamy kitchen expecting Ruth to correct a few numbers and provide a photograph beside the herd. Ruth instead placed the drought ledger before him and opened it to the $18,432 hay total. "We fed hay," she said. The writer looked from the invoice to Helen's black cloth ledger. "That isn't what I heard. It's what happened." Ruth refused a heroic profile. She gave him forage tests, body condition sheets, fecal count records, conception rates, co-op weight tickets, completed reservation lists, actual hay invoices, and return deposit entries. She showed him the 1999 and 2000 sale prices so he could see that Bellamy Range had not escaped the market collapse. It had absorbed lower prices without surrendering the breeding herd to a lender. The writer spent 2 days at Bellamy Range. He watched Ruth walk an upland transect with measured heel-first steps, the cheap green notebook held beneath one arm. He watched Helen suspend a canvas forage bag from the brass scale and wait for the pointer to settle. At the Morrow Co-op, Dale opened the locked drawer containing reservation copies and provided certified weight tickets in sequence. Dale did not improve his role in the story. "I laughed," he said. "Write that down before somebody tells you I didn't." The article appeared beneath a plain title about drought cost accounting and maternal line performance. It did not describe Bellamy Range as effortless. It printed the emergency hay expense, the falling sale prices, the deposits Ruth returned, and the years required to build useful maternal records. One full column explained why gross revenue could rise while available cash fell. Another compared an animal's purchase price with the feed, fence, water, health, and land commitments required to carry it. The article also printed Ruth's winter dry matter method. She began with actual body weight rather than an assumed average, estimated intake as a working percentage adjusted for weather, forage quality, condition, and stage of production, then compared demand with usable dry matter rather than total forage standing in the field. She treated waste as a cost and residual cover as unavailable for sale through an animal. Requests arrived from 5 plain states. Some callers wanted immediate breeding stock. Ruth gave them the reservation terms. Some wanted her grazing plan copied onto their acreage. Ruth declined because their soil, rainfall, water layout, forage species, and winter exposure were not hers. She offered the measurements she used, but the decisions still had to be made on the receiving ground. The wider attention did not change the transfer order. A rancher who had read the article that morning went behind a Custer County buyer whose deposit had been waiting 11 months. A larger order did not move ahead of a smaller one. Dale's co-op copies and Ruth's receipts continued to govern. By 2005, Bellamy Range ran 118 breeding cows. Ruth had reached that figure through retained females selected from documented maternal lines, along with a limited number of outside animals admitted only after health evaluation, quarantine, and records justified the addition. An animal was not valuable to Bellamy Range merely because its pedigree looked impressive on paper. It had to fit the forage, handling, health, and reproductive system. 96 completed sales at $885 each produced $84,960 in gross revenue. Ruth checked the multiplication as 90 sales producing $79,650 and 6 additional sales producing $5,310. Helen checked every receipt against Dale's sequence. The amount avoided by Warren Pike in 1993 had also been $5,310. Helen noticed first. She placed Warren's old avoided feed and hauling figure beside the 6 sale subtotal, but she did not circle either one. The 2 amounts had arrived by different roads and belonged to different years. Their equality required no explanation. The increased revenue paid for permanent fence replacement on controlled acreage, water storage, additional shutoffs, and pasture agreements whose cost remained below the delivered feed they displaced. Ruth bought a used portable scale only after annual rental, hauling, setup labor, and scheduling delays exceeded the ownership and calibration cost. Even then, Dale's certified platform remained the reference used to check it. By 2007, the range stock quarterly article had been copied enough times that the fold lines obscured the photographs. An agricultural association invited Ruth to speak in a meeting hall 2 counties east. The invitation promised an audience of operators interested in low-input breeding systems. Ruth accepted after asking whether the hall had a chalkboard. She arrived in the faded olive canvas chore coat, cream cotton work shirt, dark jeans, and scuffed brown boots she wore at home. Her chestnut brown hair remained center-parted and braided to mid-back. She placed the green notebook on the lectern, looked at the rows of folding chairs through thin oval steel glasses, and spent most of the session discussing fence grounding and winter dry matter calculations. Several people had expected market advice. Ruth gave them soil rods. She explained that a fence energizer rating did not guarantee useful voltage at the far end. Dry soil, inadequate ground rods, corroded connections, vegetation load, poor joins, and wire distance could turn a large number printed on a box into a weak pulse where the animal encountered it. The ground system completed the circuit. In drought, one shallow rod in dry soil could not be expected to behave like several properly spaced rods reaching better moisture. She wrote 2,100 volts on the chalkboard, then 7,100 volts beneath it. Those were the failed and repaired readings from the first Bellamy fence. A man in the second row asked what energizer brand she recommended. "The one you test at the far end," Ruth said. The room laughed, but it was the laugh of recognition. She moved from fence voltage to winter demand. A 1,000-pound animal consuming roughly 2% of body weight in dry matter required about 20 pounds before adjustments, but a wet bale was not all dry matter, and delivered forage was not all consumed. Therefore, the invoice weight, dry matter percentage, feeding loss, and actual condition response had to remain separate figures. Cold, wind, pregnancy, lactation, forage quality, and access could move the requirement. Ruth refused to turn one working percentage into a commandment. She showed the audience how to begin, measure, and correct. Afterward, operators brought sale catalogs for her to sign. Ruth signed none. She wrote voltage targets, water distances, and dry matter conversions on the blank margins instead. Bellamy range continued growing, but publication did not make the ground larger. Ruth controlled additional acres only after fence, water, lease terms, and measured production fit the operation. She retained females when future demand fit a conservative forage year. She sold them when carrying them required optimism about rain. The range stock quarterly writer returned once in 2008. He found Helen at the kitchen table, still entering costs beneath the same title. The original ledger's cloth had faded, but feed not bought remained legible. Helen had added sections for buildings not borrowed, freight avoided, pasture substituted, and repairs completed before replacement became necessary. Costs were never entered as savings if they merely shifted elsewhere. A leased pasture that displaced $10,000 in hay but cost $8,000 in rent, fence labor, water work, and travel had not saved $10,000. Helen credited $2,000 and only after actual use confirmed the displacement. Up to this point, outside attention had increased demand. It had not altered the arithmetic. By 2010, Bellamy Range controlled enough tested forage and distributed water to run 172 breeding cows. Ruth's pasture maps had become layered records. One color marked permanent water, another marked seasonal line. Pencil hatching showed recovery concerns, and dates beside each cell recorded entry, exit, rainfall, estimated use, and observed regrowth. The maps did not become prettier as they improved. They became harder to misunderstand. That year, 141 completed sales at $1,125 each produced $158,625. Ruth reconciled 100 sales at $112,500, 40 sales at $45,000, and the final sale at $1,125. Helen drew the closing line. By 2010, Bellamy Range runs 172 breeding cows and records 141 sales at $1,125 each. The 2010 ledger proves the method can scale, but Ruth still expands only as measured forage allows. Let me tell you about the next 5 years, because you need to understand how slowly an operation must move when every additional breeding female arrives with a future mouth attached to her. Ruth did not calculate carrying capacity from the best season. She used measured production across different moisture years, protected a reserve, and tested whether water placement created equal access to forage. Acres beyond a practical walking distance from dependable water could be underused while ground near a tank was grazed repeatedly. Adding acreage without correcting that pattern would enlarge the map without adding equivalent carrying capacity. Between 2010 and 2015, Bellamy Range installed additional buried line in sections that could be isolated with shutoffs. Ruth preferred loops where terrain and cost allowed them because a break in one direction did not always cut service beyond it. Where dead-end lines were unavoidable, she marked drain points and winter exposure in the notebook. Tanks sat on hardened approaches only where concentration required it. Elsewhere, Ruth moved temporary water to change distribution. She continued testing forage rather than buying mineral by habit, a supplement that supplied an element already adequate in the ration added cost and could interfere with the use of another mineral. Ruth compared forage analysis, water, animal class, season, and consumption. She watched intake because a correct formulation consumed at the wrong rate was still wrong in practice. By 2015, Bellamy Range ran 226 breeding cows. 187 completed sales at $1,460 each produced $273,020. Ruth checked 100 sales at $146,000, 80 sales at $116,800, and 7 sales at $10,220. The price had risen substantially from the market collapse years, but Ruth did not use it to value every retained female as immediate profit. Those females were producing animals carried through seasons of forage demand, veterinary work, fencing, and risk. Their value became real only through performance or completed transfer. Helen was 79 in 2015. She still sat upright at the kitchen table, though her short, deliberate steps had grown slower. Her ash-brown hair now carried more silver than brown, and the pale oval birthmark on the back of her right hand showed whenever she turned a ledger page. She remained methodical because age had not converted arithmetic into ceremony. The brass-hanging forage scale stayed in use. When the spring pointer failed to settle precisely at 0, Helen refused to accept the first sample. Ruth cleaned the pivot, checked the hook, and compared the scale with known weights. Only after the pointer returned properly did Helen allow the measurements into the ledger. "You could buy a digital one," Dale said during a visit. "We did," Helen replied. A digital bench scale sat in the workroom for finer samples, but the brass scale remained useful for canvas bags, flake checks, and quick field comparisons. Helen did not keep it because it belonged in a story. She kept it because its error could be seen, tested, and corrected. Dale continued opening the certified co-op platform when Bellamy Range needed reference weights. His sandy gray hair had thinned, and the compact rolling gait had slowed, but the red carpenter's pencil still occupied his shirt pocket. He never asked Ruth to remove his original laughter when visitors heard how the operation began. Once, a new buyer tried to spare him embarrassment by saying no one could have known. Dale looked across the co-op counter through square black-framed glasses. She knew enough to test it. He handed over the weight ticket. Between 2015 and 2020, Ruth expanded controlled acreage only where forage measurements supported the addition under written terms. She rejected one lease because the owner could cancel during drought with 30 days' notice. Cheap grass that disappeared when it was needed most could create a feed obligation larger than the rent saved. Another property had good forage but poor water and an owner unwilling to allow buried line. Ruth declined it as well. The acreage would have required hauling water or overusing the portion near an existing pond. Neither condition fit the price. The land she did control received baseline measurements before animals entered. Ruth recorded species composition, standing dry matter, soil cover, water distance, fence condition, and existing pressure around shade. She did not assign full carrying value during the first season. The ground had to show how it recovered. By 2020, Bellamy Range ran 264 breeding cows. 216 completed sales at $1,775 each produced $383,400. Helen checked the total by separating 200 sales, which produced $355,000, from 16 sales, which produced $28,400. The ledgers now occupied a cabinet rather than one kitchen shelf. The first black cloth volume remained beside the original green notebook, and Warren Pike's bill of sale remained folded where Ruth had placed it. Helen could locate a Hay invoice from 2002 faster than someone else could explain why it no longer mattered. It still mattered. In 2021, Nora Bellamy began spending regular weeks at the range. Ruth's niece was 25 then, an adult who had learned mapping and agricultural data systems elsewhere before returning with questions rather than a proposal. She did not announce that Bellamy Range needed modernization. She asked why one pasture recovered unevenly despite similar recorded rainfall. Ruth handed her a probe and the last 6 years of entry and exit dates. For 3 years, Nora mapped forage recovery, water distance, and reservation demand. By 2024, she was 28, with dark auburn hair worn side-parted and wavy, round tortoiseshell glasses, and freckles concentrated beneath her right eye. She wore a rust-red quilted vest over a pale blue cotton shirt, black canvas work pants, and dark brown ankle boots. A silver laptop traveled beneath one arm, but field cards and a pencil traveled in her pocket because batteries did not improve in rain. Nora built no model from clean averages alone. She separated slope, soil depth, exposure, plant community, water distance, season, and prior use. A pasture that recovered in 42 days during one moist spring could require twice that time under heat and limited rainfall. She marked uncertainty instead of smoothing it away. Reservation demand received the same treatment. Nora separated deposits from completed sales, single-animal buyers from larger orders, cancellations from deferrals, and requests from acreage that could not yet receive animals safely. A waiting list measured interest. It did not create forage. In 2024, Bellamy Range ran 281 breeding cows. 231 completed sales at $2,050 each produced $473,550. Ruth reconciled 200 sales at $410,000, 30 sales at $61,500, and 1 sale at $2,050. Helen checked the figure at age 88. Her gray eyes moved from receipt to receipt behind brown cat-eye reading glasses. The compact freckle cluster at her left temple had faded into the lines around it, but her posture remained upright. When her hand tired, she stopped. She did not allow Ruth or Nora to finish a page under her name. Dale, then 80, still arranged certified scale access through the co-op, though another manager opened the gate before sunrise. He reviewed the current sequence list and asked whether the portable scale had been checked against the platform after a recent repair. Ruth said it had not. Do that before you use those weights. They did. The portable scale read 14 pounds heavy across the test. Ruth removed the current tickets from the transfer file, marked them invalid, corrected the equipment, and weighed the affected animals again. No buyer received the higher figure. Dale did not mention that catching the error had justified his question. By early 2025, Nora had enough measurements to propose a test. She asked for one grazing season on land already controlled by Bellamy Range. Her plan used remote fence voltage monitors at selected points, paired with manual testing, pasture measurements, and water distance records. The monitors would not replace walking the fence. They would identify changes between inspections, especially where vegetation load, dry soil, a damaged connection, or a failed power source reduced voltage. The fixed budget included 6 monitors, weatherproof housings, grounding improvements where testing required them, communication fees, replacement leads, calibration checks, and a contingency. Nora proposed no new land, no additional breeding females, and no debt. The test would use existing pasture divisions and current labor schedules. If the equipment failed to provide useful warnings, it would not expand. She spent 11 evenings reducing the budget. The first version included 8 monitors. The second included a software subscription with features Bellamy Range would not use. The final version cost less, covered fewer locations, and asked a narrower question. Let me tell you about Nora's question, because you need to understand why Ruth did not make her wait. Nora was not asking whether a screen could manage grass from the kitchen. She wanted to know whether a timely voltage warning could send a person to the right stretch of fence before an unnoticed weakness became an animal problem, and whether those warnings could be compared with soil condition, vegetation contact, and manual readings. The proposal carried a fixed land limit. It carried a fixed cost. It carried a stop date. It created no debt. On March 9, 2025, Nora walked into the Bellamy kitchen with quick, precise steps. She stood squarely beside the table, the silver laptop closed beneath one arm. Ruth was 60 years old. Her chestnut-brown braid had silver through it now, but it still fell down the center of the olive canvas chore coat. The faint crescent-shaped birthmark beneath her right ear showed when she turned toward Nora. Helen sat at the same table in her burgundy cardigan. The brass forage scale rested nearby. Nora placed the laptop beside Ruth's original notebook and did not open it. In 2025, Nora Bellamy sets a closed silver laptop beside the old green notebook and asks for one grazing season. Nora's closed laptop rests beside the green notebook on the same kitchen table where Helen once said she needed time to think. Ruth opened the laptop. The budget appeared first. Nora had learned the order. 6 monitors, $1,890, weatherproof housings and mounting hardware, $346.80, replacement leads and test clips, $118.20. Communication service for one grazing season, $432. Calibration and reference testing supplies, $165.50. Contingency, $250. Total fixed cost, $3,202.50. Nora had placed the total against the prior year's fence inspection labor, emergency repair calls, and 2 incidents in which voltage decline had remained unnoticed between manual checks. She did not credit the project with preventing a loss that had not occurred. The benefit column remained blank until the test produced evidence. Ruth checked the controlled land assigned to the trial. It added no acreage. She checked the animal plan. It added no breeding females. She checked the termination condition. If remote readings differed materially from reference tests or failed often enough to create false confidence, the project stopped. She checked the financing line. 0. Helen watched Ruth read. Her broad jaw remained still above the white checked blouse, and the pale oval birthmark showed against the table where her right hand rested. 32 years earlier, Ruth had waited 3 mornings while Helen studied an unopened future inside a green notebook. Ruth closed Nora's budget. Yes. The word came immediately. Nora looked toward Helen, then back to Ruth. You don't need to think about it. I just did. Ruth stood, walked to the wall hook, and lifted Helen's brass hanging forage scale. The ring had worn smooth, and the face carried small scratches from years of canvas bags, hay flakes, mineral samples, and known test weights. Ruth placed it beside Nora's closed laptop. Count what the ground gives before you buy what the catalog sells. Nora picked up the scale by its ring. Up to this point, the notebook had carried Ruth's method forward. That was about to change. Nora would carry the question into a new set of measurements, but the old checks would remain beside it. Bellamy Range controlled 1,120 acres in 2025. Some were owned, some held under written long-term agreements, but every acre included in the carrying calculation had secure access, defined fence responsibility, tested water, and measured forage history. The operation carried no land debt. 286 breeding females entered the current production plan. Ruth did not count animals outside breeding condition merely to enlarge the number. She separated current breeding females from retained younger animals, health holds, and any female whose record did not support exposure. The reservation book carried 237 positions priced at $2,175 each. If every reservation became a completed sale at that price, the contracted gross value would be $515,475. Ruth did not enter that amount as revenue. Deposits remained obligations until qualified animals were transferred in order. The same distinction she had written in 1994 still governed the current page. Dale arrived alone 3 days after Nora's proposal. At 81, he held his chest slightly less forward than he once had, and his compact rolling gait had shortened, but his tan canvas vest remained over a blue chambray shirt. The red carpenter's pencil stayed in the pocket. He placed the current reservation list on the table without praise. Which weights came from the portable scale after calibration? Ruth showed him the marked sequence. Which pastures are in Nora's test? Nora opened the map. Who gets the alert first? Ruth and me, Nora said. And if the monitor says the fence is good but the handheld tester says it is? The handheld reading and the physical inspection govern. Dale nodded once. He asked whether a communication failure created a fence warning or merely an absence of data. Nora showed him that loss of signal appeared separately from a low-voltage alert. A blank reading would not be treated as a safe reading. He used the red pencil to mark one location near a long run crossing variable soil. "Put a manual check here after a dry week," he said. "That ground changes before the low pasture does." Nora wrote it down. Dale could have said he was proud of what Bellamy Range had become. Instead, he found a place where the test could fail and helped them watch it. That was the practical form his respect had taken since March 9, 1994. Before leaving, he looked at his own old waiting list entry in the first co-op order book. Ruth had filled it in proper sequence years earlier. The transfer receipt remained clipped behind the request. Dale never asked anyone to erase his laughter from the beginning. Without it, his 3 words in the barn would have carried less weight. He had been decent when he doubted, exact when he admitted the error, and useful afterward. The current list went back into its folder. Later that afternoon, Ruth opened the original green notebook for Nora. Cloth tape still reinforced the fold. The paper had yellowed around the edges, and several penciled measurements had faded where Ruth's hand once rested against them. Inside the back cover lay Warren Pike's bill of sale dated March 9, 1993. 40 underfed adult bison, 34 cows, 5 yearling females, and 1 bull, $800. Beside the bill of sale rested the first pasture map, drawn before the carrier backed through the Bellamy gate. The north ground appeared in Ruth's early pencil, divided by intended water access, fence condition, forage notes, and the coarse grass cattle had refused. The map did not show 286 breeding females, 1,120 controlled acres, or 237 current reservations. It showed what Ruth knew before any of those figures existed. Nora held the page flat without removing it. Warren Pike had once faced $5,310 in feed and hauling he could not justify. He had seen 40 adults becoming invoices. Ruth had seen mouths, ground, recovery time, wire, water, parasites, body condition, and a sale column she left blank until the animals earned an entry. The bill of sale remained the smallest document in the notebook. Helen entered Nora's trial budget in a new ledger. Her hand moved more slowly, but each figure occupied its own line. She did not place the remote monitors under savings. She wrote trial cost and left the return column open. The brass scale was absent from its usual place because Nora had taken it to the equipment shed. There she suspended a canvas bag of clipped forage beneath it, waited for the pointer to settle, and compared the reading with the digital bench scale. Ruth watched from the doorway, evenly balanced in scuffed brown work boots. The 2 scales differed by 2 ounces. Nora checked the empty pointer, found a small piece of dried stem caught near the hook, removed it, and weighed the bag again. The readings matched within the working range. She entered the result before opening the monitor boxes. The first remote unit went onto a section where dry upland soil and seasonal vegetation load had created variation before. Nora installed it beside an established manual test point, protected the leads, recorded the ground condition, and took a handheld reading. The monitor did not receive a ceremonial photograph. It received a location number, an installation date, a reference voltage, and a line in the fixed budget. A week later, the remote reading declined by 900 volts overnight. Nora and Ruth drove to the location rather than assuming the device had proven its value. The handheld tester confirmed the decline. They walked the fence until Ruth found a wind-thrown branch pressing wet bark and leaves across 2 live strands. The fence still carried a charge, but the load had reduced the far-end reading. They removed the branch, inspected the wire for damage, and tested again. The voltage returned. Nora entered the warning time, manual confirmation, cause, repair labor, and restored reading. She did not enter the value of an escape that never happened. One useful alert was evidence. It was not yet a system. Helen read the entry that evening. "What did the ground give?" she asked. "A wet branch and 900 volts of warning," Nora said. Helen turned the page. The current breeding females moved onto the next prepared cell only after Ruth and Nora checked residual cover in the one they left. 286 breeding females could remove forage quickly, but herd size alone did not determine impact. Stock density, duration, season, plant condition, soil moisture, distribution, and recovery shaped what followed. A short occupation could still be excessive if too much leaf area disappeared. A long recovery could still be inadequate if little growth occurred during it. Therefore, the calendar remained a record, not a command. The 237 reservation positions stayed in sequence. Nora's monitors did not create one additional animal for sale. Their test concerned information between inspections, and Ruth refused to translate information into carrying capacity before the ground showed a change. On March 9, 2025, the kitchen table held the closed silver laptop, the green notebook, Helen's current ledger, and Warren Pike's $800 bill of sale. Outside, the breeding herd crossed controlled ground toward water placed where use could be distributed rather than concentrated. The fence carried a tested pulse. The reservation list waited for animals that did not yet qualify as completed transfers. Ruth closed the notebook over the original pasture map. She bought 40 adults for $800. They called them feed bills. The market collapsed. The drought came. Borrowed money broke other operations. Bellamy Range kept grazing. As of March 9, 2025, Bellamy Range is still measuring what the ground gives. This story isn't over, not even close.